The word Qur'an is the word that is normally used to describe the revelations that were received by the Prophet Muhammad between 610 and 632, the year of his death, from the angel Gabriel, which were turned into a book, into a corpus, which forms essentially the holy book of Islam, the basis of Muslim faith. The Quran itself was an oral experience and only became a written experience in the decades following the Prophet's death. And the impetus behind the codification, the production of an actual written text, actually came because of many different reasons. On the one hand, the people who recited the Quran were actually being lost in tens in the battles of the spread of Islam, and at the same time disagreements about how to read the Quran properly and therefore how to interpret the message started to proliferate as Islam spread, across geography and time. So the closest companions of the Prophet are the ones who already during the Prophet's lifetime, but immediately afterwards, decided to start collecting written versions of these revelations. And eventually the Caliph Othman, who is the third of the rightly guided caliphs, was the one who produced the consonantic version, the text as we know it today, and very much what is still in use to this day, the way it's organized. But it does not reflect the way the Quran was actually revealed to the Prophet. So the book as it looks is not the way in which these messages, these divine revelations first reached the Prophet himself. The text is presented in a very interesting way. Each page has a sort of a central panel with a beautiful frame with sort of highlighted by a number of colors. And then you find 3 bands on each page written in gold, and then a central panel which is sort of smaller dimensions sitting in between. The text is continuous in the sense that you are supposed to be reading the large verse and then continue your reading down to the smaller verses. But what is interesting is that the scribe has used 2 different styles, 2 different techniques or hands to write these verses. The ones in gold are in a style that is known as thuluth, whereas the one at the center, which is tinier and tidy and compact, is known as naskh or naskhi. And these are 2 cursive styles that were adopted for writing the Word of God relatively late in time, and by late I mean really maturing after the 13th century, when a major revolution in the sort of refinement of the calligraphic styles happened under the leadership of Yaqut al-Musta'simi, who is one of the most prominent calligraphers of medieval Islam, and that really made the cursive scripts appropriate and proportioned enough and elegant enough to be used for writing the Word of God. The Word of God in previous centuries, in fact, is written in completely different styles. So sometimes the style of writing is actually one of the indicators for a rough dating, or at least for a sort of a time span for the production of the manuscript itself. And we do need this in this manuscript because this manuscript came without a date. So these indexes are very useful for us to try to narrow down time and place of manufacture. One last thing that I want to mention is the presence of these medallions. There are medallions panels within the text block, and then there are beautiful medallions that sit on the margins. As the illumination of Qur'ans developed and was formalized, normally the medallions at the margins, as well as tiny little flower-shaped medallions that sit with the text, were used to mark the verse division, a 5-verse division or a 10-verse division, so that when the person recites, knows how many verses of that specific chapter have been recited. And so, as well as essentially decorating the book and enhancing the appeal and the aesthetics of the book. What we are looking at actually are very functional devices that split and articulate the book. What is interesting in the case of this specific text is that unlike it normally happens in other texts, the position of these is always the same, whereas in some cases, as verses of the surahs are inevitably longer or shorter, the way they fall on the margins varies on each page, which is not the case on this manuscript. Why this is the reason, we're not entirely sure, but it is still interesting to think about the fact that these devices were maintained, and sometimes sort of red inscriptions indicate the division, a further division into juz or parts, which really helped with the recitation of the Quran in specific moments in times. During the month of Ramadan, for instance, is particularly praiseworthy and important to be able to recite the entirety of the Quran during the 30 days. So a division in 30 parts helps, because you know when you reach the point to stop for a sort of your daily recitation. Sometimes you have a division in 7 for the 7 weeks of the day. Sometimes you have an indication of division in 4 parts, which eventually sort of give you more text and more passages to essentially recite and meditate on over a shorter span of time. So in all instances, the decoration that you see has oftentimes also a very functional and practical purpose, and that's simply the way in which Muslim calligraphers sort of developed and again formalized the decorative apparatus that makes elegant versions of this book so prized and so beautiful. I think it was used, you know, I mean, we know that elaborate copies of the Quran were produced for private devotion in the same way as books of hours and gospels were produced for the private devotion of kings and queens in this part of the world, you know. In other words, the fact that you were a king, you could afford to have a particularly fine copy of what is the basis of your day-to-day sort of religious practice. And so these works were very much used, and in this instance I haven't looked through the book in extensive details, but sometimes you find corrections or personal notes that indicate a certain level of interaction with the object itself, commentaries, or there are instances in which manuscripts actually provided sort of a good way to hide messages, you know, as manuscripts move between people. So they were used objects in addition to being clearly prized presentations and elegant presentations of iconic texts, as the Quran would have been in Iran at the time.
You can also, because it's been cut down a manuscript over time, it sort of suggests that there was wear and people were turning the pages. And like even here you can see the finials on the end of the shamsas have been added in and like more like later day ink that's not the same lapis as before. So it suggests that it's had a history of people using it and feeling it.
Yeah, that's a very good point actually. Oftentimes this idea about refurbishing and rebinding goes with extensive use, not only with the sort of the prestige and importance of the text that you're trying to preserve, and this is very much so for the Qurans, of which across Oxford collections we have many different examples, and all of them you can also see the marks and the way in which the lower area of the page is actually worn out, which indicates the pigments of these areas, which is exactly where you would possibly turn. You probably do it from the top as well, but instinctively that's the place where I would probably tend to turn the page. So indeed, this is a further indication of the fact that the book didn't sit close and perfectly maintained, but in a way was